She was 23 and alone. No suitcase, no room key, no family name that could shelter her. Just her grandfather's wrapped carving knives and $5 she had kept folded inside the lining of her winter coat. And with that $5, she bought a forgotten moose antler carving den outside Rangeley in Franklin County, Maine, where the lane had fallen off county maps in 1979. One corner of the roof had dropped 6 inches. Ice had split the back sill clean through. The county said the building had been closed since 1988 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the oak carving bench, in a hidden compartment that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Quinn Tallpine had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She learned the habit early, before she had words for it, in the narrow house behind her grandparents' place where the wind came through the bathroom window and lifted the edge of the curtain like a hand asking to be excused. Her mother kept a calendar on the refrigerator but rarely turned the page on time. Her father's photograph, the only one that stayed in sight, stood in a brown frame beside the telephone, showing a young man in a wool cap with one mittened hand raised against white glare. People said he had gone north for work and never properly come back, and adults lowered their voices when they said it, as if distance itself could be a kind of death. Quinn grew up with a careful step. She knew which floorboard complained near the pantry, which cabinet door clicked if it was closed too quickly, and how to make toast without waking anyone on mornings when the house had gone sour with silence. By 7, she could fold towels into exact thirds. By 9, she could tell from the tires in the drive whether supper would be eaten at the table or alone on the porch. By 12, she knew that some children were raised by answers and some were raised by weather. Her mother, Elaine, was not cruel in the usual ways people understand cruelty. She did not shout often, she did not break plates, she wore pale lipstick and kept her hair pinned with pearl-headed combs from the drugstore, and she spoke softly enough that strangers called her sweet. But there was a distance in her, smooth as pond ice, and Quinn had spent much of her childhood standing on its shore. Elaine could look directly at her daughter and seemed to be watching something behind her, some earlier life where things had gone more exactly, and where a child had not arrived needing bread, shoes, and witness. So Quinn learned to take her questions elsewhere. Most weekends, when she could get free of the chores her mother made sound casual and necessary, Quinn walked the half-mile to her grandparents' house, carrying whatever the season asked her to carry. In summer, blueberries in a coffee can. In fall, kindling tied with twine. In winter, nothing but her hands tucked up inside her sleeves and her chin lowered against the clean bite of snow. Her grandfather, Amos Tallpine, would be waiting in the shed behind the kitchen, where the light came through a single high window and settled on the bench in one patient rectangle. He was not a large man, but he had a way of taking up the room with stillness. His hair, long and white, was tied at the back with a strip of dark leather. His shirts carried the smell of cedar smoke, linseed oil, and cold air. On one wall hung thin saws, curved knives, burnishers, awls, rasps, and small files, darkened from years of thumb and palm. Amos made his living unevenly. Some autumns he guided hunters through wet spruce and black mud. Some winters he repaired snowshoe frames, cane chair seats, and broken knife handles for men who paid him late but respected his hands. But what he kept, what he guarded without speaking of guarding, was the older work, moose antler. Bone, horn, material that looked dead until the blade found its grain. He told Quinn that antler was not wood, not stone, not ivory, though foolish people treated it like all three. It had a memory of growing. It held a curve made by hunger, weather, rut, and survival. If a person cut against that memory, the piece would split at the place where pride entered the hand. Their ritual began the same way each Saturday. Amos set an enamel pot on the stove and warmed water until it steamed but did not boil. If the antler was thick, he wrapped it in damp cloth first and let it rest overnight. If it was thin, he soaked it in a tub for 2 days, changing the water when it clouded. He showed Quinn how to test softness with the edge of her thumbnail near the base, not on the polished crown. He taught her to mark with charcoal, never ink, because ink entered pores and stayed there like a careless word. When she was 10, he let her hold the straight knife. When she was 11, he gave her a curved blade with a handle made from maple burl. By 13, she could rough out a loon's neck, a line of river teeth, the slanted shoulder of a running deer. By 15, she knew how to polish with pumice, until the surface took light without glare, then finish with a square of old chamois that had once belonged to her great-grandmother. He did not explain the old patterns all at once. He placed them before her slowly, the way a person might set bread before someone who had forgotten how hunger worked. The double curve, the water line, the winter count, the seed mark, the tracks that crossed and returned. He said the Abenaki old ones did not need to make a thing loud for it to last. A mark could carry a story if the hand was honest enough not to decorate the truth out of it. One November afternoon, when rain struck the shed roof with such steady force that the world beyond the window seemed rubbed away, Quinn ruined a piece of pale antler by forcing the blade through a tight bend. The tip skipped, cut deeper than she meant, and left an ugly scar across the figure's side. She set the knife down, cheeks hot, waiting for Amos to sigh. He only picked up the piece, turned it once in his fingers, and handed it back. Never ask the cut to hurry. That was all he said. For years afterward, Quinn carried those words without knowing their weight. They meant antler. They meant grief. They meant hunger, anger, work, and any life built with two hands after other hands had refused it. They meant that the material would reveal itself if she stopped demanding that it become useful before it was ready. Amos died in late October, after 3 days of rain and 1 morning of hard blue cold. The maples had already stripped themselves down to black bones, and the gutters at the grandparents' house clicked with frozen leaves. Quinn had been sitting beside his bed, rubbing beeswax into the handle of his old awl because he had asked her to do it, when his breathing changed. Not stopped, changed. It became distant first, as if he were walking away through tall grass. Her grandmother, Ruth, had died the winter before, smaller each week under a quilt she had pieced from worn shirts. The house had been quieter since then. Without Ruth's humming, even the clock in the hall seemed too formal for the rooms. After Amos was gone, the silence lost its walls. The funeral was held at a white church near a road salted grey by early ploughs. Men from town stood with their hats in their hands. 2 guides came from Rangeley country, one with a beard full of sleet, one carrying a thermos he never opened. An older woman Quinn did not know touched her sleeve and said Amos had carved her husband a pipe tamper in 1966, and that he had refused payment because her husband had just come home from the war and could not sleep. Quinn wanted to ask about the old tools. She wanted to ask about the finished antler pieces. Amos kept wrapped in cloth inside the cedar chest under his workbench, the ones he had shown her only on certain afternoons when the light was low and gold. But the house filled with relatives after the burial, and every drawer seemed suddenly to belong to someone with louder certainty. Her cousin Bryce moved through the rooms with a legal folder under his arm. Bryce was 31, clean-shaven, with soft hands and a watch that flashed when he lifted a cup. He had visited his grandparents on holidays, bringing grocery store pies and stories about real estate, then left before the dishes were washed. In the days after the funeral, he became very exact. He spoke of paperwork, transfer, probate, liability, valuation. He used such words the way other men used padlocks. Quinn watched him stand in Amos's shed, looking at the tools as if they were inventory from a closed restaurant. He opened the cedar chest and lifted the wrapped pieces without washing his hands. His thumb pressed into one cloth bundle. A small sound came from Quinn before she could stop it. Bryce looked over his shoulder. "These will need to be appraised," she said. "Grandad wanted those kept together." Grandad did not leave instructions. The sentence entered the shed and stayed there. There was a will. There was one name in it. Bryce had been made heir because his mother, Elaine's older sister, had handled the practical papers when Ruth first grew ill. Quinn had not known enough then to ask what was being signed, or by whom, or what a child who had slept under that roof half her life might need to have written down. Care does not autorize itself. Years of washing sheets, lifting medicine bottles, rubbing warmth into Ruth's fingers, and sharpening Amos's blades before market days had left no official mark. Elaine did not challenge it. She came to the house on the 3rd day wearing her good grey coat and the expression she used in banks, Her eyes passed over Quinn's face, then lowered to the floor where two cardboard boxes sat open near the stairs. One held Quinn's sweaters, the other held books, a chipped mug, a hairbrush, and the pair of wool socks Ruth had darned with blue yarn because there had been no grey left. Bryce stood near the front door with one hand resting on the knob, already impatient with the cold entering around him. The hall smelled of wet wool and lemon oil. Outside, the yard was scabbed with old snow, and the lilac bush Ruth had loved scratched against the siding. He had placed a black plastic trash bag beside the boxes. That was the physical thing Quinn would remember later. Not his face, not the paper, the bag. Thin, glossy, open-mouthed, waiting for whatever did not fit neatly into her life. Bryce said exactly 8 words. "You cannot stay here after tonight, Quinn." Elaine stood behind him, her purse strap held in both hands. She did not look surprised. She did not look away. Her silence had the practiced shape of agreement. Quinn bent and picked up the bundle of carving knives wrapped in Amos's old work apron. No one stopped her. Perhaps they did not understand what the bundle was. Perhaps Bryce had already counted larger things. Perhaps Elaine saw and chose not to name it. The blades lay against Quinn's forearm with a familiar weight, handles pressing through canvas like knuckles. She took one sweater from the box, then another. She took Ruth's socks. She took her father's photograph from the brown frame by the telephone, leaving the frame empty on the table. She did not take the cedar chest because Bryce had locked the shed. She did not take the antler pieces. She did not take the kitchen clock, though. Ruth had wound it every Sunday night for 34 years. At dusk, she stepped out onto the porch with the 2 boxes and the bundle under her arm. Her breath showed in front of her. A truck passed slowly on the road, tires whispering over sand. Behind her, the door closed without force. That was worse. For the first week, Quinn slept in a church basement in Farmington, Maine, on a cot near a radiator that knocked awake every hour and filled the room with a dry metallic heat. The women who ran the shelter called everyone honey, but their eyes were tired and exact. She kept the carving knives inside her coat sleeve while she slept, not from fear that someone would harm her, but because they were the last objects in her possession that had been touched with intention. She had $37 then, from the envelope Amos used to keep in the coffee tin for emergency lamp oil. She spent 4 on bus fare, 2 on a day-old loaf, 1 on coffee she made last until noon, and 79 cents on a pencil from a drugstore because she had begun writing numbers down in the back of a library discard book. The arithmetic steadied her. If she could count what remained, then life had not become entirely smoke. In Lewiston, she slept 2 nights in the waiting area of a bus station before a security guard with red hands told her she needed a ticket or a destination. He was not unkind, that was the trouble. He looked ashamed to say it. She thanked him, because Amos had taught her that a person could keep manners even when almost everything else had been taken. In Portland, she slept behind a laundromat where the vent exhaled warm soap air into an alley. The city smelled of salt, diesel, and old brick after rain. She washed her socks in a restroom sink and dried them under her coat while walking. A woman at a bakery gave her the heel ends of 3 loaves in a paper bag, then pretended not to see Quinn tuck one under her arm for later. By the 4th week, her money had thinned to $19 and some coins. By the 5th, to $11. By the 6th, to $7.43. Not counting the 5 she had sewn into her coat lining 2 winters before, after Amos told her every traveler needed 1 bill that did not get spent unless the road itself asked for it. She moved north again because south had become too crowded with locked doors. Augusta gave her 1 night in a warming center, then a morning of freezing rain. Skowhegan gave her a library chair near a window and a bathroom where she could wash her face without being hurried. In Waterville, a clerk at a grocery store let her sweep the entry for a bruised apple and a wrapped sandwich past its date. In Phillips, a woman with a limp gave her a ride 12 miles in an old Subaru full of feed sacks and did not ask questions until they were almost there. "What's in the bundle?" "Tools." "What kind?" "Carving." The woman nodded as if that explained enough. At night, Quinn unwrapped the knives and checked them for rust. She oiled them with the smallest trace from a bottle she had taken from Amos's shelf. using a rag cut from the hem of her second shirt. Each handle had a place worn by his fingers. Each blade carried a shape of patience she could still enter, if she was careful. The advertisement appeared on a Wednesday in the public library at Rangeley, though Quinn did not know yet that Rangeley would become the hinge on which her life turned. She had gone in for warmth first, and then for the classified board, because libraries in small towns still kept paper notices where a person without a phone plan might find work, rides, rooms, and the occasional hand-lettered mercy. The building smelled of dust warmed by baseboard heat. A moose head hung over the reading room fireplace, its glass eyes aimed above everyone. There were flyers for snowmobile repair, church suppers, maple syrup, a lost orange cat named Biscuit, and one notice printed in faded county ink and pinned crooked beneath a curling announcement for a quilting circle. County property release. Structure unfit for occupancy. Former carving den outbuilding. Rangeley Township. Purchaser assumes all ply. Picture this. Purchase all Brap. Minimum bid $5. Inquire Franklin County Clerk. Quinn read it once, then again. Former carving den. The words did not rise from the paper so much as settle into her hands. Around her, a child turned pages too quickly in the picture book corner. Somewhere behind the desk, a printer hummed and stopped. Snow tapped against the windows in grains, so fine it looked like sifted flour. She copied the address with the pencil she had bought weeks before. Her hand was steady until she reached the price. Minimum bid $5. The hidden bill in her coat seemed suddenly heavier than money had any right to be. A sensible person would have kept walking. A sensible person would have used that last bill for food, bus fare, a bed, a chance to remain among the living in ordinary ways. Quinn knew this. She stood there long enough for the librarian to look up twice. She folded the copied notice into fourths, then eighths, and slid it into the back of her book of numbers. Outside, the afternoon had begun turning blue around the buildings. The lake lay under a hard skin of ice beyond the road, and the hills were dark with spruce. Quinn walked to the edge of the parking lot and stood near a snowbank marked by sand and exhaust. her coat lining pressed against her ribs where the bill had been sewn. Amos had once told her that a tool unused for too long begins to forget the hand. She had no house. She had no legal claim to the rooms where she had learnt the names of plants, medicines, cuts of wood, and winter birds. She had no proof that years of care counted for anything in the offices where paper mattered more than witness. But she had the knives. She had the old instruction in her muscles. She had $5 that had survived hunger because some quiet part of her had refused to spend it. The county clerk's office would open at 9 in the morning. That night, Quinn slept under the overhang behind a closed bait shop, with cardboard beneath her and the wrapped knives between her coat and chest. The temperature dropped until the snow hardened with a thin crust, and every passing truck sounded like it was crossing frozen bone. She did not sleep much. Near dawn, a plough moved through town, patient and deliberate, pushing the road clear for people who had places to go. When the first pale light came over Rangeley Lake, Quinn sat up, brushed frost from the hem of her coat, and took the folded notice from her book. By noon, if the clerk accepted the bill, she would own a condemned building no one wanted, on a forgotten lane outside town, with a roof sagging toward ruin, and a past sealed inside its walls. She began walking before the sun reached the courthouse steps. The first bus north left with its windows filmed in grey breath and road salt. Quinn sat 3 rows behind the driver, the wrapped bundle of knives across her knees and her coat buttoned to the throat, though the heater under the seat was blowing hot air against her boots. The bus had come through Farmington before dawn, taken on 2 men with lunch pails, a woman carrying a cardboard box of prescriptions, and an older couple who spoke only once, quietly, about whether their son would have the driveway ploughed by supper. The road rose and fell through snow-dark country. Spruce crowded close to the shoulders. Mailboxes leaned at angles where ploughs had shouldered them all winter. Now and then a house appeared behind a white field, lit in one kitchen window, then passed back into trees as if it had never meant to be seen. She counted the miles because counting had become a form of shelter. Wilton, Phillips, Madrid Township. The driver announced stops with a voice made hoarse by cigarettes and early hours, and each place seemed to receive the bus without surprise. A man got off near a road where stacked pulpwood lay under snow. A girl in a red parka got on with skates tied together by their laces. By the time they reached Rangeley, the temperature on the bank sign read 18 degrees. The number glowed red above a drifted sidewalk, clean and pitiless. Quinn stepped down from the bus with one box under her arm, the knife bundle held beneath it, and the copied notice tucked inside her mitten. The courthouse business was not in Rangeley proper. The driver had told her, but there was a county desk operating twice a week from a municipal office near Main Street for abandoned property releases, tax forfeitures, and structures no one could reasonably insure. She could file there first. The final stamp would be forwarded. "You got business with that desk," he had said, watching her in the mirror. "You better get it done today. Weather's coming." She thanked him and stood a moment after the bus pulled away, feeling the departure in her teeth. Rangeley at mid-morning carried the hard brightness of a town accustomed to winter. Snowbanks stood along the street like cut white walls. The storefronts were modest but kept, their windows swept clean where hands could reach. A sporting goods shop displayed wool socks, traps, orange caps, and hand-tied flies in small drawers. Beside it, a diner sent out the smell of bacon fat and coffee through a vent above the door. Across the street, a pharmacy window held cough syrup, reading glasses, and a handwritten sign for flu shots. Farther down stood a hardware store with a green awning, a post office with brass boxes visible through the glass, and a narrow bookshop whose door carried a bell on a leather strap. Quinn noticed these things because she had almost no right to enter any of them, not yet. A place with lit windows could be harder to face than an empty road, because it showed exactly what a person lacked. She walked past the diner first, though her stomach pulled at the smell. A man in a red cap shoveled the front step, and leaned on the handle as she passed. His dog, a black and white mutt with one ear folded wrong, watched from the open bed of a pickup. The dog did not bark. It only lifted its nose to test the morning and then tucked its paws under its chest again. The municipal building stood behind 2 bare maples, its white paint weathered along the lower boards, its ramp shoveled down to grey planks. The flag outside snapped once in the wind, then hung still. Inside the entry, heat gathered at ceiling height and left the floor cold. There was a bulletin board with notices about snowmobile routes, burn permits, an AA meeting, a town supper, and one sheet listing properties transferred for tax non-payment, demolition, or county release. Quinn took off one mitten to smooth the copied notice before she approached the counter. The clerk's office was smaller than she expected. There were 2 desks, 3 filing cabinets, a coat tree leaning slightly from the weight of parkas, and a brass service bell that no one had polished in a long while. Behind the counter, a woman in her late 60s looked up from a ledger and removed a pair of reading glasses from a chain around her neck. Her hair was the colour of clean ash, cut in a straight line at her jaw. She wore a cream cardigan over a blue blouse, and on the desk in front of her sat a nameplate so rubbed at the edges that the brass showed through the black paint. Doris E. Whitcomb, County Clerk, Franklin District Desk. She did not smile. She did not frown either. Her face had the settled patience of someone who had watched many people try to make hope fit inside paperwork. Morning. Good morning, ma'am. What can I do for you? Quinn placed the notice on the counter, using both hands so the paper would not tremble. I came about this property release. Doris Whitcomb lowered her glasses onto her nose, leaned over the notice and read without moving her lips. Then she looked at Quinn's coat, the box under her arm, the canvas-wrapped bundle, and the place where her boots had left wet marks on the floor. You walked here. From the bus stop. Where did you come from before that? Quinn hesitated. South? The clerk received the answer without pressing it open. She stood, crossed to a filing cabinet, and pulled the second drawer with a sound like a drawer in a courthouse, metal on metal, exact and unforgiving. She took out a folder tied with cotton tape. The folder had darkened along its edges and bore a red stamp that read structure unsafe in letters that had bled slightly from age and damp. You understand this is not a residence? Yes, ma'am. You understand the building has no certificate of occupancy? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no inspected well, no approved septic, and no electric service? Yes, ma'am. You understand the roof is compromised, and the county will not be responsible if it comes down? Yes, ma'am. You understand that if you take title, you take the burden with it? Yes, ma'am. The repetition did not embarrass Quinn. It steadied her. Each warning had a shape. Each answer made that shape smaller than the cold she had already slept in. Doris opened the folder and laid out 4 papers in a row, aligning them with the edge of the counter. Her fingers were narrow, the knuckles enlarged, the nails cut short and clear. There were ink stains on the side of her right thumb. Most people come in thinking these abandoned releases are bargains, she said. They imagine a cabin, maybe a little land, something to fix up on weekends. Then they see the photographs. She turned one paper around. The black and white photograph showed a low building crouched among bare trees. Snow had collected along one roof plane where the pitch had failed. A small stone chimney leaned a few degrees away from plumb. The siding was rough pine, dark from weather, with one boarded window and one door hanging slightly out of square. Above the door, a wooden sign still held the ghost of carved lettering, not readable in the county photograph. Quinn looked at the picture for longer than the clerk expected. The building did not look dead to her, it looked withheld. How far is it from here? 3.5 miles by the road, more if you miss the turn. I won't miss it. Doris gave her a look over the glasses. Everybody says that? She took another sheet from the folder. This one had a hand-drawn map made in blue ink, Main Street, the Lake Road, a turn past an old stone culvert, a private lane marked with a dotted line and the word unimproved written twice, once in print and once in smaller script below it, as if the first warning had not seemed sufficient. There's a neighbour about 1/2 mile before the lane, Doris said. Name of Calder. He does not like strangers, but his wife will call the sheriff if she sees smoke where smoke ought not be. That is worth knowing. Yes, ma'am. There is a dog at the property south of there. Big hound, mostly noise. Yes, ma'am. The road does not get ploughed beyond the Calder mailbox unless somebody pays for it. Yes, ma'am. There are walnut trees near the den. Branches come down heavy in ice. Yes, ma'am. Doris set the map aside. You have cash for the filing? Quinn opened the seam inside her coat lining with the blunt edge of her thumbnail. The stitching had been done in dark thread, small and tight, and it resisted her for a moment before giving way. She drew out the folded bill. It had gone soft from years against cloth and body heat. One corner had a pale mark where damp had once reached it. She laid it on the counter and smoothed it with her palm. The clerk looked at the bill, then at Quinn. That is your bid? Yes, ma'am. You have anything else? Quinn did not answer quickly enough. Doris understood. For a moment, the room held only the sound of the wall clock and the soft ticking of baseboard heat. Then the clerk took the bill, wrote a receipt by hand, and slid it across the counter. I am required to say the county accepts no responsibility for personal hardship arising from purchase. Yes, ma'am. I am also required to say you may withdraw before signing. Quinn looked once at the photograph, once at the map, and then at the wrapped tools under her arm. I won't withdraw. Doris studied her for another second. Then she uncapped a fountain pen and placed it on the line. Full legal name. Quinn wrote carefully. She formed each letter the way her grandfather had taught her to mark guidelines on pale antler, exact enough to hold, light enough not to bruise the surface. The ink dried with a faint gloss. The clerk turned the page, tapped the next line, and Quinn signed again. Then came the waiver, then the assumption of liability, then the receipt acknowledging title transfer pending county registry entry. When all the papers were signed, Doris reached beneath the counter and lifted a brass stamp from a wooden tray. It was heavy enough that she used both hands. The handle had gone dark where decades of clerks had gripped it. She aligned it over the bottom corner of the deed, pressed down with one deliberate motion, and the desk answered with a deep metallic clack. The sound moved through Quinn's chest. Doris lifted the stamp. The seal shone wetly in blue ink. Franklin County released property. That makes it yours for county purposes, she said. Registry confirmation will trail behind by mail, though I suppose mail is a question. I can collect it here. You can. The clerk folded one copy into an envelope, wrote Quinn's name across it, then paused before handing it over. Tallpine, she said. Quinn kept still. The woman said the surname again, not loudly. I knew that name. Quinn's fingers closed around the edge of the counter. Doris removed her glasses and let them rest against her cardigan. There was a man with that name used to come through this office years back, brought permit sketches, old survey questions, once a dispute about a logging path somebody had cut too close to burial ground. Polite man, long hair, carved the head of a trout on a walking stick for my brother after he broke his hip. Quinn looked down at the envelope because the office had become too clear. He was my grandfather. I wondered. The clerk did not offer sympathy in the easy way some people did, as if sorrow were a coin they could hand over and be done with. Instead, she opened the top drawer of her desk, took out a paper clip, and fastened the map to the envelope so the two would not separate. He did not talk much, she said, but when he did, people listened. Yes, ma'am. Doris slid the envelope across. That den may have belonged to someone in his line before it went through the county. The file is broken. Some records burned in the town office furnace in the 70s before anybody learned shame about losing paper. There is a Tallpine mark on one of the older survey scraps, but I cannot make promises. I understand. No, you probably don't. The clerk's voice stayed level. That is not an insult. Most people cannot understand a place until it has made them cold. Quinn took the envelope. Doris reached for a drawer again, then stopped herself, as if weighing law against something older and more exact. After a moment she took the folded bill Quinn had given her and placed it not in the cash drawer, but beneath the glass paperweight on her desk. I will enter this properly at closing, she said. Quinn nodded because she knew a private act when she saw one, and because naming it would have broken its usefulness. The clerk gave directions slowly out the door, left past the pharmacy, continue until Maine gave way to the road curving around the lake, keep the water on the right, past the white church with the red doors, then the bait shed with the tin roof, then a line of split rail fence half buried in snow. At the old stone culvert, turn onto a road that had no sign. If she reached the mailbox painted with loons, she had gone too far. If she reached the Calder farm, she should not cut through the yard no matter how much shorter it seemed. Follow the lane until the walnut trees, Doris said. The den sits beyond them, set back from the road, door faces east. Thank you. The clerk put her glasses back on. Do not light a fire until you know the chimney drawers. I won't. Do not sleep under the sag. I won't. Do not trust old ladders. I won't. Doris looked at her coat, the damp hem, the box, the tool bundle. And do not let pride freeze you. Quinn had no prepared answer for that. So she gave the only one she had. Yes, ma'am. Outside the day had brightened without warming. A few flakes moved sideways in the air, dry and hard as salt. Quinn stood on the sidewalk with the envelope inside her coat and watched a pickup stop before the post office. The driver went in carrying 2 packages under one arm. The black and white dog she had seen earlier had moved from the truck bed to the cab, where its nose had fogged a crescent on the passenger window. She walked first to the edge of town because she did not trust herself to pass the diner again. Hunger had a voice, and hers had begun to speak in the slow, calm tone of a reasonable person. She had 1 apple in her box, soft at one side. She ate it beside a stack of bagged ice outside the sporting goods shop, turning the bruised part away from her teeth and saving the core in her pocket, because waste had become an accusation. The road out of Rangeley bent toward the lake, and the wind there came clean across the frozen surface. The ice looked dull under the sky, a broad pewter field running between dark shores. Cabins stood back among pines. Some had smoke lifting from chimneys. Some were closed for the season, their windows shuttered, their decks buried to the rails. Snowmobile tracks crossed the ditches and disappeared into trees. Quinn walked on the ploughed edge, stepping into the bank when trucks approached. The envelope under her coat gave a stiff rectangular press against her ribs. Every half-mile she checked that it was still there. The road sand crunched under her soles. Her box grew heavier. Once she shifted the knife bundle from one arm to the other and felt the handles knock lightly together inside the canvas. The white church with red doors appeared after the first rise. Its cemetery lay behind it, stones leaning under white caps. At the road's edge, a hand-painted sign announced a bean supper for Saturday and a verse from Isaiah below it. Quinn slowed but did not stop. A shovel stood beside the church steps. Someone had cleared the walk before sunrise. The bait shed with the tin roof came next, smaller than she expected, with minnow tanks stacked outside and an old sign offering crawlers, smelts and coffee. It was closed. A chain crossed the door. She passed the split rail fence, half buried as promised, and began watching for the culvert. The stone culvert was almost hidden under snow, but the road dipped there, and water could be heard below the ice, moving in a dark, narrow throat. Beyond it, a break opened in the trees. No sign marked the turn. No mailbox stood there. Just 2 tire ruts under a thin cover of blown snow, angling away from the main road into spruce and hardwood. Quinn turned. The lane had not been ploughed, only crossed by deer and 1 set of narrow animal tracks that might have been fox. She lifted her knees high and placed her boots into older depressions when she could. The snow was crusted on top and soft beneath, so every third step broke through to mid-shin. Branches clicked overhead. A crow moved somewhere unseen, its call dry and scolding. After a quarter-mile she came upon the first neighbour. The Calder place sat back behind a row of frozen lilac bushes and a stone wall with gaps where frost had shifted it. The house was square, white and plain, with a woodshed attached to the back and a blue tarp over one section of roof. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight column, which meant the air had stilled. At the end of the drive stood a mailbox with black letters, Calder. A man in a brown coat stood near the woodshed, splitting kindling with a hatchet. He stopped when he saw her. He did not raise a hand. He only waited. Quinn lifted her chin in greeting. He watched until she had passed the drive, then went back to the wood. The hatchet sound followed her down the lane, measured and hollow. Farther on, the dog announced itself before she saw the house. It came bounding from behind a wire fence, long-legged, brown-eared, loud with territorial duty. Quinn stopped and let it speak. Its bark rolled out into the trees and came back thinner. After half a minute, an older woman opened a side door and called the dog by a name Quinn could not catch. The hound looked offended but returned, glancing over its shoulder twice as if to say this matter was not settled. The lane narrowed after that. Walnut trees appeared in a rough line along the north side, their trunks dark and ridged, their branches high and bare against the pale sky. Their fallen nuts lay hidden under snow, but here and there a squirrel had dug down and left brown husks scattered over the surface. Wind moved through the upper limbs with a sound less like rustling than low speech. At the end of the lane, the den waited. It stood lower than it had looked in the photograph, no more than 24 feet long and 16 feet wide, built on a fieldstone foundation that showed in places above the snow. The siding was pine, rough sawn, laid vertically, darkened almost black on the north wall and silvered on the east where morning light had struck for decades. The roof was cedar shake under patches of tin, with one plane sagging toward the rear as if a great hand had pressed it down. A short stone chimney rose from the west end, its top bricks uneven, its crown cracked and white with old lime. The door faced east, just as the clerk had said. Above it hung the sign. The letters were worn nearly smooth, but Quinn could make out enough when she stepped close and brushed snow from the lower edge with her mitten. Tallpine carving. Bone, horn, antler. Repair and work by hand. The words had not been painted, they had been cut. Even weather had failed to erase the small certainty of the blade. Quinn stood there until the cold entered her ankles. The front step had collapsed on one side. She climbed carefully, testing the boards before trusting weight to them. The door had swollen in its frame, then shrunk again, leaving a dark gap along one edge. A county padlock hung through a hasp newer than the surrounding wood. Doris had given her the key in a paper envelope, the metal taped inside so it would not tear through. Quinn took it out with stiff fingers. The key resisted. She breathed into her hand, warmed the teeth, tried again. This time the lock opened with a click that sounded too small for the distance she had come. When she pulled the door, it moved 3 inches and stopped. Something inside had shifted against it. She set down the box, put both hands to the edge, and eased it wider. The bottom scraped across the floor, pushing a drift of old leaves and mouse-bitten paper inward. The smell came out first. Dry bone, pine dust, cold ashes, damp stone, mice, time. She stood at the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The front room took the eastern light poorly, but not unkindly. There was a work counter along the left wall, a narrow shelf above it, 2 stools overturned near the cold stove, and a line of pegs where coats or aprons once hung. Against the right wall, bundles of antler rested upright in racks, some whole, some cut into tines and beams, their surfaces pale as moonlit bark. A few had been tagged with string. The paper labels had browned until the writing blurred. The floor was wide pine, cupped and ridged from years of damp, but most boards remained sound near the centre. At the far end stood the stove, black iron, squat and plain, with its pipe rising into the chimney. Its door hung slightly open, showing a mouth of grey ash. Beside it sat an enamel kettle with no handle. Quinn stepped inside. The room answered with a creak beneath her left foot, then another near the centre. She waited, listening. No part of the roof shifted, no plaster fell. A mouse moved inside a wall with a sound like fingernails on paper. The back room lay through a low doorway framed by hand-planed boards. It had no window, only a small square opening high on the wall that had been boarded from outside. Here the air was colder and more densely scented with old work. A long oak bench stood in the middle of the room, its top scarred by blades, awls, clamps and years of pressure. The bench was massive, made not for moving but for staying. Beneath it were shelves, drawers and shadows. On the back wall hung a wooden case with its doors closed. Quinn did not open it yet. She moved slowly the way Amos had taught her to enter unfamiliar woods, by noticing what the place noticed back. A cracked crock near the bench held antler dust hardened by damp. A broom leaned in a corner, straw eaten short by mice. On a shelf sat 3 jars, each with something inside gone black and dry. There were pencil marks on the wall near the door. small notches with years beside them, but the light was too poor to read. She returned to the front room because the roof sag was there, and because night would come early. She dragged one overturned stool away from a damp patch and set her box on it. She placed the wrapped knives on the work counter, then unwrapped them just enough to check for moisture. The handles were cold but dry. She wrapped them again. The first practical question was where not to die. The county photograph had shown the rear roof plane failing, so she chose the front room near the east wall, away from the sag and away from the stove until she knew the chimney. She inspected the ceiling with care. Water stains spread like old maps between rafters, but the boards above the front wall looked firm. She pressed one with the handle of a broom and watched for dust. Only a little fell. She swept the chosen place with the ruined broom, pushing mouse droppings, leaves and antler shavings into a careful pile near the door. She found a square of canvas folded on the bottom shelf of the counter, stiff with dust but not rotten. She shook it outside until a cloud rose and drifted toward the walnut trees. Then she laid it on the floor, added her sweater, Ruth's socks, and the coat she would not remove until she had to. Light thinned. The den changed when evening entered it. Edges softened. The antler racks became pale shapes along the wall. The stove held its black mouth open outside. The walnut branches tapped one another once, then stilled. Quinn ate the last of the apple core she had saved, though there was almost nothing left on it, and drank snowmelt from her cupped hand after warming it in the enamel kettle with body heat only because the stove was not yet trustworthy and she had promised the clerk. Her breath showed all night. She slept in pieces, a board ticked, something moved behind the antler rack. Once, far away, the hound began barking and was answered by another dog across the lake. The cold came up through the floor, through canvas, through wool, through bone, but the roof did not fall. That became the first mercy of the place. Nothing came down. Near midnight, she woke and opened her eyes to darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then her hand found the knife bundle beside her ribs, and the smell of dry antler returned, and the room gathered itself around her. She did not pray in words. She placed one palm flat on the pine floor and listened. The house had been waiting, and so had she. By morning the water in the enamel kettle had frozen into a cloudy lens. Quinn held it near the eastern window until the pale light entered it, then set it on the floor and chipped a small place with the back of a spoon she found in a drawer under the front counter. The spoon had been bent at the neck long ago and straightened imperfectly. Its bowl carried black spots where tin had worn away. She put a chip of ice under her tongue and let it dissolve while the room slowly revealed what darkness had hidden. The first 3 days were not days of beginning. They were days of not making anything worse. She learned where the floor spoke and where it stayed honest. The board just inside the door gave one dry complaint and then held. The 2 boards near the stove dipped if she stepped too close to the wall. A narrow plank in the back room lifted slightly at one end, and she marked it with charcoal so she would not catch her boot there in darkness. She learned that the rear corner under the sag stayed colder than the rest, as if the roof had let winter enter and given it a chair. Outside she found the well 20 paces beyond the north wall, its cover half hidden under snow and held down by 2 stones. The bucket rope had rotted through, and the pulley, though iron, had rusted into an oval of reluctance. She did not trust it. Instead, she packed snow into the kettle and set it near the one place where afternoon sun came through the eastern glass. Meltwater tasted of dust and cedar, but it was water. The outhouse stood beyond the walnut trees, tilted but upright, with a crescent moon cut into the door and a raccoon's tracks on the threshold. The seat was cold enough to make her breath catch. She swept it out with a fallen branch, found a nest of dry leaves in one corner, and set a flat stone against the bottom of the door to keep it from swinging open in the wind. Practical dignity, Amos had once said, mattered most where nobody saw it. Each morning she inspected the chimney from below without lighting the stove. She held a scrap of paper near the open damper and watched for movement. Nothing. On the second afternoon, a faint downward breath carried soot onto her wrist. On the third, when the wind shifted, the paper stirred upward for 1 second and then hung limp. Not enough. Not yet. She ate little, the bakery heels were gone. A woman at the library had left a sleeve of crackers beside her chair without making a speech of it. Quinn made them last across 2 days, breaking each square into 4 pieces and laying the pieces on the counter before eating so she could see that there was order. At night, she wrapped her feet in Ruth's socks, then in the canvas, then tucked them beneath the lowest shelf of the counter where the draft could not reach directly. By the 4th morning, the need for supplies had become larger than caution. She walked back to town along the lane, stepping in her previous tracks where they had frozen hard overnight. The colder man was not outside. Smoke rose from his chimney, and a red sled leaned against the woodshed. The hound at the next place barked once, then seemed to recognize the shape of her poverty and gave up. Rangeley Hardware stood between the pharmacy and the bookshop, with a green awning darkened by old snowmelt and a bell over the door that sounded not bright but worn inside. Warmth smelled of oiled metal, seed packets, kerosene, leather gloves, mousetraps, and coffee left too long on a hot plate. Narrow aisles held bins of nails sorted by weight and purpose. Rolls of tar paper, stove rope, lantern mantles, brass screws, putty knives, axe handles, and shelves of paint cans with labels turned outward in disciplined rows. A man behind the counter looked up from sharpening a plain iron. He was built spare and tall, with shoulders slightly rounded forward from years of bending over benches. His beard was white at the chin and darker along the jaw. One lens of his glasses had a tiny crescent scratch near the edge, and when he looked through it, he tipped his head just enough to avoid the floor. His shirt was flannel, green and brown, the cuffs frayed clean through at both wrists. Morning. Good morning. He waited. Quinn had learned that small-town men behind counters often let silence do the sorting. Some people filled it with lies, some filled it with pride. She placed the county envelope on the counter and opened it. I bought the Tallpine carving den off the release list. The plain iron stopped moving. That right? Yes, sir. You the one Doris mentioned? Quinn did not know whether that was good. She might have mentioned me. She does that when she's worried. He set the plain iron down on a folded rag and took off his glasses. Name's Silas Mercer. He did not offer his hand across the counter, which she appreciated, because hers were cracked at the knuckles and grey with stove dust. Instead, he looked at the copy of the deed, then at the list Quinn had written in pencil the night before. You planning to heat it? After I know the chimney is safe. That is an answer with sense in it. I need to clean it first. You got rods? No, sir. Brush? No, sir. Ladder? No, sir. He looked at the knife bundle she carried, tied in canvas and tucked under one arm. You got tools, though? Some. What kind? Carving. Silas nodded once, not as if that explained everything, but as if it explained what mattered. She laid her supply list on the counter. He read it slowly: chimney brush, fiberglass rods, stove rope, work gloves, tin pail, scraper, wire brush, matches, kerosene lamp wick, small bag of oats, salt, candles, tarp, nails, twine, a manual if he had one cheap enough. When he looked up, his face had changed very little. You have money? No, sir. None. No, sir. You asking for charity? Quinn folded her hands around the edge of the counter. The wood there had been worn silky by hundreds of wrists. I am asking whether you keep accounts. Silas stood still a long moment. Behind him, a clock advertising marine varnish ticked over the door to the back room. Accounts are for people with addresses. I have one now. Not one the postal service respects. No, sir. Not one with heat. No, sir. Not one with a roof that promises anything. No, sir. He picked up the pencil and turned her list over. What can you do? Clean, stack, carry, sand, sharpen, sweep, mend handles. I can carve, but not fast. Nobody worth paying carves fast. The sentence sat between them, plain and exact. Silas wrote numbers beside each item. Used 6-inch chimney brush. $8, 3 fiberglass rods, $6 for the lot because one had a cracked coupling but would hold if taped. Roll of aluminum tape, $2.39. Stove gasket rope, 4 feet at 65 cents a foot. Work gloves, $3. Tin pail dented, $1. Long scraper, $3.50. Wire brush, $1.29. Kitchen matches, 79 cents. Lamp wick, $1.10. 2 candles, 50 cents each. Small blue tarp, $7. 4 pounds of oats, $2.40. Salt, 49 cents. 1 pound of cut nails from an opened box, $2. Twine, 95 cents. He added without hurry. $42.11. Quinn looked at the number. I can work it down. You will. He reached under the counter and brought out a softcover book whose cover had faded from red to a tired pink. Home repair for camps, cabins, and outbuildings. The spine had been taped with black cloth. Pages bristled with slips of paper, receipts, and old lumberyard notes. This is not for sale. I understand. It belonged to my brother, he wrote in the margins. Some of it's wrong. Most of it isn't. I'll bring it back. You will bring it back dry. Yes, sir. Silas placed the book on top of the pile. No charge for that unless you ruin it. If you ruin it, I will be unpleasant. I won't ruin it. He made no visible sign of being amused, but something around his mouth softened. The next hour became instruction instead of transaction. He showed her how to assemble the rods and warned her not to ram the brush hard at the flue bend. He sold her the cracked coupling, but wrapped it himself with tape, pulling the aluminum smooth with his thumbnail. He gave her a coffee can half full of old screws and told her not to use them on anything weight-bearing. He cut a square of heavy plastic from a damaged drop cloth and folded it into the tarp bundle. For the stove opening, he said, tape it tight before you brush down. Soot will find every hole pride leaves. The phrase sounded enough like Amos that Quinn looked away. When she lifted the supplies, the weight surprised her. Silas came around the counter and balanced the rods across the top, tying them with twine in a way that made a handle. You got a sled? No, sir. He disappeared into the back and returned with a child's red plastic sled scratched white along the bottom. Handles cracked. I can return it. You can keep it until mud season. I do not know how to thank you properly. Pay the account. Yes, sir. That is proper enough. The trip back took nearly 2 hours. The sled turned over twice on the rutted part of the lane, spilling the brush, rods, oats, and dented pail into snow. Quinn repacked everything with fingers gone stiff inside the cheap gloves. By the time she reached the den, the sky had lowered, and the walnut branches had begun to gather the first fine threads of new snow. She did not begin the chimney that evening. Instead, she opened the manual by the last grey light and read the chapter on flues, draft, creosote, and stovepipe until the words became a set of tasks she could carry. Inspect, seal, brush from top if possible, brush from bottom if roof access unsafe. Remove pipe contains soot, check for cracks, test draft with smoke, not flame. Keep water near, never trust a chimney that has slept longer than you have lived. The next morning she started before sunrise. First, she cleared the stove area, moving antler pieces, stools, and the enamel kettle away from the hearth. She spread the plastic over the stove mouth and taped it along the iron, leaving a slit just wide enough for the rod. Then she wrapped her scarf over her nose and mouth, tied her hair back with a strip from Ruth's torn sock, and set the tin pail beneath the lower clean-out door. The clean-out door did not want to open. She worked the scraper along its edge, tapped gently with the handle, waited, tapped again, and finally felt the crust give. A smell came out that was older and denser than ordinary ash. Creosote, the manual had said, could be flaky, tar-like, glazed, or all three in one flue. This chimney had kept all its years. Black flakes fell first, brittle as burned leaves, then a hard, glossy ridge where smoke had cooled and layered itself into danger. She scraped slowly, collecting what she could. The sound was intimate and unpleasant, metal against mineral, a dry jawing in the narrow space. She filled half the pail before she had even assembled the brush. Because the roof was not trustworthy, she worked from below. The first rod went up through the stovepipe opening with resistance. The brush caught at the bend. She turned it clockwise, not forcing, letting the bristles find their way. Soot rained against the plastic and sifted through one place where the tape had folded on itself. She stopped, sealed the leak, and continued. One rod, then two, then three. Each upward push took strength from her shoulders and back. Each downward pull brought black dust with it. She worked in sets of 10, then rested with her hands on her knees while the room settled around the hidden rain of soot. After 2 hours, her scarf was black. After 3, the pail was full. After 4, the brush began to move more freely, and the sound inside the chimney changed from muffled drag to a harsher rasp. She removed the stovepipe next. One screw had rusted into place, so she soaked it with a little lamp oil and waited 20 minutes rather than stripping it in haste. When it came loose, she set it in the pail and brushed each section outdoors, standing downwind. Black flakes scattered over the snow, making a field of dark scales near the back wall. At noon, she ate dry oats from her palm and drank melted snow. At 1, she went back inside. She checked the flue with a hand mirror she found in a drawer, cracked across one corner but still useful. Holding a candle stub unlit beneath it for angle, she caught a pale line of sky far above. Not clean, not perfect, but open. The crown would need work. The mortar had gaps. One brick near the top had shifted, yet the passage breathed. By mid-afternoon, she performed the smoke test. She twisted newspaper into a loose cone, lit the tip outside, blew it out until it smoked, and held it near the stove opening. The smoke hesitated, then rose, not quickly, not greedily, but upward. Quinn sat back on her heels and closed her eyes. Only after cleaning the hearth, reseating the pipe and checking the damper twice did she build the first fire. She used pencil-thin twigs gathered from beneath the walnuts, then split pieces of fallen pine, then 2 short lengths of dry hardwood she found stacked under the front counter, left there by a hand that had not known how much a future winter would need them. The match rasped against the box. The sulphur flare was brief and sharp. Flame took the curled birch bark, then the twigs, then the kindling. At first the stove smoked at the seams, and Quinn's body tightened. She adjusted the damper, opened the door a finger width, and waited. The smoke thinned. The chimney pulled. The first true heat entered the room like an animal returning from a long absence. It did not make the den warm all at once. Heat does not repair years in a minute, but the iron darkened, then dulled, then began to give off a low steadiness that reached Quinn's hands where she held them near the stove. The frost along the inside of the eastern window loosened and ran in narrow lines. A drop fell from the sill to the floor, another followed. She cooked oats in the enamel kettle that evening, stirring with the bent spoon. The meal had no milk, no butter, no sugar, only salt and water, but steam rose from it, and that was enough to make it holy in the plainest way. She ate slowly while sitting on the floor, back against the wall, boots near the stove, listening to the chimney drawer. For the first time since the funeral, she slept 4 hours without waking. The following morning, with heat holding faintly in the iron and daylight clearer through the frost-thinned glass, Quinn began the inventory of the workroom. She did it as Amos would have done, item by item, no guessing, no romance, no claiming before knowing. She tore blank pages from the back of the manual only after deciding she would replace them with paper of her own before returning it. At the top of the first sheet, she wrote "Back room contents." Antler rack north wall, 7 full moose paddles, dry but sound, 11 cut beams, 2 cracked lengthwise, 34 tines sorted by length, tied in bundles of 5 except 1 bundle of 4, 1 piece burned at tip, maybe lamp accident. Lower shelf, west wall, 3 rasps, rusted but recoverable, 1 half-round file, 1 flat file with broken tang, 2 wooden clamps, hand-screwed, 1 jaw split, 6 strips of old leather, pumice stone, worn hollow on one face, bundle of chamois wrapped in paper, stiff but usable, drawer 1, charcoal sticks, chalk, 2 awls, 4 small gouges with mushroomed handles, broken compass, folded pattern paper with water stains, 4 brass pins, 1 button. Drawer 2, empty except for mouse nest and 3 acorns. Drawer 3, locked. She paused there, tried the pull and did not force it. Hanging case, back wall. She opened the doors carefully and found blades arranged in slotted wood, not Amos's tools, older, straighter. The handles were dark, some bone, some maple, some antler turned smooth by hands. Several blades had black spots but no deep rust. A paper label pinned inside the door read, "Keep dry." Beneath it, in smaller pencil, someone had written, "Oil twice yearly, whether used or not." Quinn touched nothing for a long time. She moved to the bench last. The oak carving bench dominated the room in a way she had felt the first night but not fully understood. It was 7 feet long, nearly 3 feet wide, and built from slabs thick enough to have come from a tree felled before her grandparents were born. The top carried cuts in arcs, lines, slips, and repeated shallow grooves where blades had begun and ended. The front edge had been worn into a soft hollow at the centre, just where a standing carver's body would have leaned into patient work. There was a vise at the left end, wooden screw intact though dry. There were dog holes along the top, some round, some slightly oval from use. The legs were square and plain, joined by stretchers that showed no wobble when she pressed them with her knee. Under the top, on the front side, were 2 drawers and an open shelf. The drawers stuck but opened after careful persuasion. One held shavings so fine they had become a pale felt. The other held a whetstone, a bone folder, 3 tags written in faded ink, and a tiny rolled scrap of sandpaper. She wrote all of it down. Only then did she notice the sound. It came when she set the whetstone back in the drawer and closed it. The drawer struck home with a dull wooden note, but something beneath the bench answered differently. Not an echo, not the floor, a compact, lower sound, as if a second hollow lay behind the first. Quinn stood still. She opened the drawer and closed it again. There it was. She knocked once on the top with her knuckle, solid. She knocked along the front rail, solid. She tapped the left leg, right leg, stretcher underside. Each gave its own honest note until she reached the thick apron beneath the work surface, where the sound changed again, lower, kept. Weight test came next. She pushed the bench from the side. It did not move. She lifted one corner with all the strength she had and raised it no more than a hair. Of course it was heavy. Oak of that thickness would be heavy, but this was more than wood. The bench held weight in its middle, centered and deliberate. She crawled beneath with a candle. The underside was shadowed by age and old dust. Spiderwebs joined the stretchers. A strip of leather hung from one peg, stiff as bark. She ran her hand along the underside of the apron and found nothing but rough wood, then tried again more slowly. Her fingertips found a circle. Not metal, not a knob, a cedar disc set flush into the underside of the bench, slightly warmer to the touch than the oak around it. It was no wider than a silver dollar, and had been darkened with soot or stain. At its centre was a small carved mark, 2 crossing lines, and a curve below them like water held under winter. Her breath shortened. She pressed the disc. Nothing. She turned it. Nothing. She remembered the county file, the broken records, Doris saying a Tallpine mark had appeared on an older survey scrap. She remembered Amos telling her that hidden work should never need violence to open. A good maker left a way in, even if it required humility. She backed out from beneath the bench and studied the legs. The front right leg had a knot near the bottom, or what looked like a knot until the candlelight changed. The circle of grain was too exact. Quinn knelt and traced it, a plug. She pressed. It did not move. She pulled with her fingernails and broke one nail to the quick. Pain flashed cleanly through her hand. She waited until it passed. Then she took the smallest awl from the wool case, placed its tip at the edge of the false knot, and lifted gently. The plug came free with a sigh of dust. Behind it lay a narrow cavity. Inside the cavity was a wooden strip, no thicker than a ruler, and polished along one side from having once been handled often. She drew it out. The strip was maple, dark with age, its end shaped to a small flat tongue. She took it beneath the bench, fitted it against the cedar disc, and felt for a notch. The tongue seated, she slid it sideways. For a moment, nothing happened. Then somewhere inside the bench, a wooden latch released with a sound so soft it might have been a bird moving in leaves. The whole lower face beneath the top shifted forward half an inch. Quinn sat back on her heels and stared. She did not pull it open at once. The room seemed to require a pause. She set the candle on the floor, wiped both hands on her skirt, and loosened the scarf from around her neck. Then she gripped the hidden panel with both hands and drew it toward her. It came slowly, not as a drawer but as a shallow tray built into the thickness of the bench. Dust broke along its edges. Something inside shifted, heavy and wrapped. The compartment was lined with cedar. That was the first mercy cedar had kept insects away, had kept damp from entering fully, had held its dry breath around whatever had been placed there. Inside lay 3 oilcloth packages, a narrow wooden box, a tin cigar box, and a packet tied with red thread. On top of all of it rested a flat piece of antler, carved with a line of geese flying over water. Quinn did not touch the packet first, though the red thread drew her eye. She chose the nearest oilcloth bundle and opened it with the care a person uses when unwrapping something sleeping. Inside were tools. Not many, not showy, but heirloom tools of the kind no catalogue could restore once lost. A straight knife with a handle of dark antler polished almost black, a bent knife with a narrow hook blade, 2 gravers wrapped in waxed paper, a small bow drill with its cord still intact but brittle, 4 burnishers made from bone, each marked at the end with tiny notches, a fine saw with a spine no thicker than a ruler, and teeth so delicate they seemed more drawn than cut. She laid them on the bench in order. The second oilcloth held raw material, small prepared antler plates, cut thin and flat, 3 sections of moose beam sealed at the ends with wax, 2 pieces of bone labelled in pencil, and a little pouch of powdered pumice tied shut with black string. Each piece had been chosen. Each had been waiting without complaint. The third oilcloth was heavier. She opened it last among the packages, and when the cloth fell back, 18 carved antler pieces lay nested in strips of wool. Quinn did not understand them all at once. She only knew with a certainty that arrived before thought that they belonged together. They were each the size of a small hand, shaped from pale moose antler and polished to a soft shine. One showed a river breaking through ice. One showed a woman planting beside a curved moon. One showed a fish beneath a net. One showed a bear entering a line of trees. One showed 2 canoes, one empty, one full. Another held only marks: seed, track, flame, cloud. They were not ornaments, they were chapters. Her grandfather had taught her enough to know that. She placed them in a line along the bench, left to right, following the direction of the watermarks where she could. The sequence was not perfect in her understanding, but the pieces seemed to lean toward one another. Human, animal, tree, river, fire, snow, return. The story did not sit in words, it lived in relation. The narrow wooden box held a folded chamois, 2 vials of darkened oil, a sharpening stone wrapped in cloth, and a carved handle with no blade. The packet tied with red thread she left untouched because it felt like writing, and she was not ready for writing. That left the tin cigar box. It was green once, perhaps, or blue. Time had taken the colour down to something between. The lid bore a brand name nearly gone. A strip of cloth had been tied around it twice, not for beauty but to keep it from opening if moved. Quinn untied the cloth, lifted the lid, and went very still. Money lay inside. Not fresh bills, not bank-banded stacks like in stories told by people who have never been poor. These were folded, sorted, and kept with the same discipline as tools, bills of different years, some silver certificates, some red seal notes, some newer 20s wrapped in paper slips. There were envelopes with handwritten amounts on them, coins in small cloth bags, a roll of $50, a little paper packet of wheat pennies, 2 silver quarters worn smooth at the edges, 3 mercury dimes, 1 buffalo nickel with the date nearly gone. She did not count it then. Her hands had begun to shake, and shaking was not useful. She put the lid back on the tin, set it aside, and went outside into the cold. The sky had cleared while she was in the workroom. Late sunlight lay low among the walnut trunks. The snow in the lane had taken on the blue of evening. She stood until her breathing settled, and her hands stopped moving against her will. Then she went back inside, built a careful fire, ate oats, washed her hands in melted snow, and began. She counted on the bench, not the floor. She made columns on paper. Bills first, sorted by denomination. Ones, fives, tens, 20s, 50s, hundreds. Older notes separate. Envelopes opened only after their labels were copied. Coins last, not by guessed value but by type, date when readable, and count. The work took hours. The stove cooled once, and she fed it without looking away from the rows. Twice she stopped to correct herself because hunger and disbelief had crossed wires in her mind. At midnight she had one number. She checked it against the envelope markings. At one she checked again. $44,100.37. The 37 cents mattered. She wrote it carefully. Beside the money, in the bottom of the cigar box beneath a square of felt, lay a military medal darkened with age. The ribbon had faded but still showed its stripes. The back was engraved with a name she did not yet know fully how to place, and a year, 1944. There was also a small brass button, a folded newspaper clipping too fragile to open under lamplight, and one photograph cut down to fit the box. The photograph showed 3 people standing before the den in summer, the sign above the door clearer then, the walnut trees in leaf behind them. She turned the photograph toward the candle but did not recognize the faces. The packet tied with red thread remained where she had placed it. She knew it was a letter. She could feel the shape of folded paper beneath the wrapping. She could see, even in the uncertain light, that the thread had been tied with intention, not secrecy alone. A person had left it last because it was meant to speak after the objects had spoken first. Quinn did not open it. Not that night. There are kinds of knowledge that ask for a rested body, a swept room, clean hands, and daylight. There are truths a person can damage by grabbing them too soon. She had found money enough to eat, repair, survive. She had found tools that had crossed years without losing their purpose. She had found carved pieces that seemed to hold a people's old seasons in their polished faces. She had found evidence that the den had not been abandoned by neglect alone. That was already more than one night could carry. She placed the money back into the tin, the medal on top of the felt, the photograph beneath it, and closed the lid. She wrapped the carved antler pieces again, each in its wool strip, though she paused over each one and tried to remember its place. She returned the heirloom tools to their oilcloth but kept them on the bench, not in the hidden tray. The letter she left in the center, tied and waiting. Then she carried the candle outside. The snow had stopped. The world beyond the den was still but not empty. Moonlight lay across the lane in long blue pieces. The walnut trees rose black from the ground, their limbs holding stars between them. Far off, water moved under ice at the culvert, a muted running that had continued all winter whether anyone heard it or not. Quinn walked down toward that sound. She did not take the road all the way. She stopped where the trees opened enough for her to see a pale strip of Rangeley Lake through the dark trunks. The lake was frozen hard, but at the mouth of a narrow inlet the water had broken free in a black seam. It moved there quietly, shouldering aside the edges of ice, making no declaration of itself. She stood with the candle cupped in both hands until wax touched her skin. There would be no sleep for a while. Not the easy kind, but there was a difference between being kept awake by fear and being kept awake by the arrival of responsibility. One hollowed a person, the other asked her to stand. When the candle finally guttered, she turned back toward the den. Through the eastern window the stove cast a low red pulse on the floorboards. The hidden bench stood in the back room, opened now, no longer silent in the same way. Quinn entered, closed the door against the cold, and sat beside the tied letter without touching it. The house had been waiting, and so had she. Morning came without warmth, but it came clean. The storm had moved east in the night and left the sky above the walnut trees a hard, rinsed blue. Sun entered the front room at a low angle, catching on the soot Quinn had missed near the stovepipe and turning each black speck briefly silver. The fire had gone down to a red seam beneath ash. She fed it 2 pieces of split pine, waited until flame took, then set snow to melt in the enamel kettle and washed her hands with care. Not well, not fully. The water was too cold at first, then too precious. But she rubbed her fingers with ash and salt. rinsed them twice, and dried them on the cleanest corner of Ruth's old socks. Under each nail a dark line remained. Work had already entered her skin. The letter sat where she had left it, centered on the oak bench. In daylight, the red thread was not red exactly. It had faded toward rust, but where the knot crossed itself, protected from air, a deeper color still held. The paper beneath had yellowed unevenly. One edge bore a water stain that had stopped short of the writing inside, as if the cedar compartment had taken the damage upon itself and spared the message. Quinn untied the thread slowly. The knot had been made by someone with hands that understood both use and patience. It loosened only after she turned it once, then eased one loop backward through another. She laid the thread beside the packet, straightened it with 2 fingers, and opened the folded paper along its old creases. The handwriting stopped her before the words did. It was not Amos's hand, but it belonged near his, the same forward lean, the same unhurried spacing, the same clean crossing of the T, made not with flourish but with decision. Letters sat on the line as if each had been placed after listening to the one before it. Quinn had seen that discipline in the labels tied to Antler bundles, in the pencil notes on pattern paper, in the way her grandfather wrote dates on jars of oil and wax. This hand was older than his. She sat on the stool by the bench, placed both feet flat on the pine floor, and began, "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened this bench, then the house has been silent longer than I meant it to be, and I am either gone from this earth or too far reduced by illness to return my hands to the work. I write from a boarding room in Lewiston, Maine, after Dr. Elias Moreau has given me the name of what has been taking my strength. He called it consumption of the lungs, though he spoke the word tuberculosis when he believed I would bear it plainly. I prefer plain words. They let a person set her tools in order. My name is Miriam Tallpine Wobben. I was born in 1892 near Odenac, where my mother's people had kin, and came as a child to the Rangeley Lakes with my father, Joseph Tallpine, who guided hunters and cut spruce in winter when the money thinned. His father was Samuel Tallpine, born in 1838 near Norridgewock, after the old families had already been scattered and renamed more times than any person deserved. Samuel's mother was Alnoba Rose, born about 1816 along the Missisquoi, a woman I never knew except through marks on horn, and a song my father sang only when he believed no one was listening. You must understand that a family may lose land by paper, language by punishment, and names by the convenience of clerks, yet still keep a way of making that tells the truth. The antler pieces wrapped in wool are not trinkets, they are a reading chain. My great-grandmother learned the first marks from her mother, who learned them when such things were kept close and brought out only beside winter fire. The river piece begins the sequence, then seed, fish, berry, moon, track, storm, child, fire, grief, return. I carved the last 6 myself, after my father's hands bent with age. The trade began to close on September 14th, 1931. When a man from Augusta came with 2 others and posted a notice on the door saying work in bone and antler could no longer be sold from this room without licensing, inspection, and payment beyond anything we could make in a year. He said it was about sanitation. He would not look at the clean cloths, the boiled water, the drying racks, or the records my husband kept. The truth was simpler. Tourist shops wanted Indian work without Indian hands. They bought factory carvings by the crate and called them safer. After that day, customers stopped coming by the road and came instead by memory. A guide would leave a note under the 3rd stone by the well. A widow would send a boy with a broken comb. A veteran would arrive at dusk with an antler button in his palm, asking if it could be matched. We worked that way more than 30 years, not secret in shame, but quiet in order to remain. My husband, Daniel Wobben, served in France in the Great War and came home with 1 lung never fully willing. My brother Peter Tallpine did not come home from the Meuse-Argonne in 1918. My son Joseph enlisted in the next war and was killed in Italy in 1944, near a place called Anzio. The medal in the tin belongs to him. I could not place it in the ground because no ground near me felt prepared to receive all that had been taken. If you are able, carry it to a place where the dead are named properly. Now listen to the work. Moose antler must not be bullied. Soak thin plates in clean water for 48 hours, changing the water morning and night. For thick beam, Steam it 2 hours over water kept just below a rolling boil, near 190 degrees if you have a thermometer, then wrap it in wool and let it settle 10 minutes before cutting. Saw with the grain using a fine backsaw. If the blade shatters, the piece is too dry, or your hand is ahead of your eye. For polishing, use pumice with a little oil, 2 parts powder to 1 part oil, then finish with dry chamois until the surface gathers light without showing vanity. To darken lines. Use lampblack mixed with beeswax, warmed no hotter than a baby's bath, and wipe clean before it hardens. The oil in the small bottle is bear grease cut with cedar, old but perhaps still serviceable. If it has soured, do not use it. Make new oil from what is honest and available. A tool must be clean before it is sacred. A hand must be patient before it is trusted. Do not sell the reading chain unless hunger leaves no other door. Even then, sell one plain thing first. The chain is not mine, though I made part of it. It belongs to the line that can still read it, and if that line has been broken, it belongs to the one willing to learn without taking. Inheritance is not only what the law carries from one name to another. Sometimes inheritance is what survives the law. Sometimes it is a bench too heavy to steal, a mark under cedar, a knife oiled after the maker has died, a house left looking empty so greed will pass it by. I have hidden money here from mending, guiding, carving, and doing without. Use it slowly. Use it to keep weather out, fire safe, hands fed, and the work unashamed. If you are kin, know that I have waited for you. If you are not kin, and you opened this without breaking it, perhaps the house chose you by the shape of your care. Either way, do not hurry. Sweep first, repair what protects life. Read the pieces in winter. Begin with the river. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Miriam Tallpine Wobben, October 3, 1967. Quinn read the letter once without moving. The fire shifted behind her, and one pine knot snapped softly inside the stove. Outside, a small weight of snow slipped from the roof edge and fell into the drift below. The room accepted these sounds and gave them back gently, as if nothing in the world had changed, though everything that mattered had taken on another name. She read the letter a second time. This time she stopped at the places where the hand had pressed harder. Consumption. September 14th, 1931. Anzio. Do not hurry. Begin with the river. She traced no words with her finger, not wanting skin oil to darken paper already spared by luck and cedar. When she reached the signature again, she sat until the letters ceased being marks and became the motion of a woman sitting in a rented room, breath poor, back straight, arranging a future she could not see. Quinn folded the paper along its original creases, not new ones. The old ones knew where they belonged. She tied the red thread loosely around it, not sealing it away this time, only keeping it gathered. Then she placed the letter on the chamois inside the narrow wooden box and set the box at the centre of the bench. The line about the third stone by the well returned before she understood why. She put on her coat, took the small shovel from beside the stove, and went out through the back door. The snow behind the den lay smoother than the lane, marked only by squirrel tracks, her own steps from the day before, and Wynn's patient combing. The well cover sat under its 2 stones just as she had found it. Beside it, half buried beneath crusted snow, were several flat stones set, not as nature had dropped them, but in a short line leading toward the walnut trees. She cleared them one by one. The first stone was plain. The second had split along a mica seam and flashed when sunlight touched it. The third was larger, oval, and settled deeper into the ground. Quinn worked the shovel beneath its edge, careful not to chip it, then lifted with both hands. Frozen soil resisted. The stone broke free all at once and rolled onto its side. Under it lay a horseshoe. Not an iron shoe thrown by accident or left from some farm animal long gone. This one had been placed points upward, cleaned once, though years had darkened it. A strip of cloth had been tied around the curve and had nearly rotted away. Beneath the horseshoe was a flat cedar token, no bigger than her palm, carved with the same river mark she had seen on the disc beneath the bench. Quinn crouched there until cold soaked through both knees. The marker had not protected treasure, not money, not another hidden chamber. It had protected direction. It said that Miriam's letter had not invented itself. It said the people who had worked here had made signs for the careful and left nothing for the greedy but rotted boards and weather. Quinn set the horseshoe back under the third stone, but she kept the cedar token. Not in her pocket, not yet. She carried it in both hands to the den and placed it beside the first carved antler piece, the one showing a river breaking through ice. The marks were not identical. One was more formal, one more worn, but they spoke the same language across years. In the narrow wooden box beneath the chamois, she had seen 2 candle stubs wrapped in paper. She took one now and unrolled it. The wax had yellowed with age. It was beeswax, not paraffin, with a faint smell of honeycomb and smoke. A label on the paper read, "Made by Ruth L., 1907. 60 years before Miriam's letter and more than a century before Quinn's hand held it. The wick had darkened but remained whole. She set the candle in a shallow iron holder near the bench. For a long moment she only looked at it. Some objects asked not whether they were useful, but whether the hand approaching them understood the cost of use. Then she lit it. The flame took slowly, bending blue at the base before straightening to gold. Beeswax warmed into the air, carrying a sweetness so faint it seemed less a smell than a memory of summer fields. Its light touched the heirloom tools, the wrapped reading chain, the cedar token, and the letterbox. It did not brighten the room much, it did something more exact. It gathered it. Quinn sat beside that little flame until morning's first strength had passed into afternoon. She began thinking not in a rush of gratitude, but in a chain of small exact kindnesses that had not announced themselves as rescue. The woman at the Portland bakery placing heel ends in a paper bag and pretending not to notice how quickly Quinn took them. The security guard in Lewiston, ashamed of the rule he had to speak, giving her 5 extra minutes under the bus station heat before he walked back. The woman with the limp and the Subaru full of feed sacks, letting silence ride between them like something decent. Doris Whitcomb placing the $5 bill beneath the glass paperweight instead of dropping it into the drawer where ordinary money forgot its own story. Silas Mercer wrapping the cracked chimney rod with his own hands and pretending an account was only business. None of them had known what lay inside the bench. Kindness rarely knows what it unlocks. She warmed water, cleaned the tin box, and cleared the front counter. Then she stood for a while with one hand on the bench, thinking of those watching this story from a couch, a kitchen chair, a recliner beside a sleeping dog, a bedroom where the TV speaks softly so the house does not feel empty. Maybe you remember a small kindness that carried you farther than the person offering it ever knew. A sandwich handed across a counter, a ride in bad weather, a clerk who treated you with dignity when you had almost none left to defend, a neighbor who shoveled without asking to be praised. If such a thing ever found you at the right hour, write it down somewhere, even if no one else reads it. Tell someone, leave a note, put the memory where bitterness cannot spend it. There are people walking cold roads tonight who will survive because a stranger did one exact, careful thing and asked for nothing in return. Quinn did not know how to repay the dead. So she began with the living. She took out the page where she had written the hardware account and added the supplies again, this time more neatly. The debt would be paid, the manual would be returned dry, the clerk's office would receive a mailing address once the den could receive mail, the bakery woman, wherever she was, would remain unnamed but not unremembered. This was not sentiment, it was bookkeeping of another kind. Evening came early under the trees. She did not open the tin box again. She did not count the bills a third time. She did not unfold the letter except to place it wrapped in chamois beside the heirloom tools at the head of her sleeping place. The 18 carved antler pieces she left on the bench covered with wool, the river piece on top because Miriam had instructed it so. Before lying down, she banked the stove, checked the pipe, and set the dented pail of water within reach. She placed the old candle in its holder on the floor near the wall and let it burn a little longer, watching the flame bend each time the den breathed through its cracks. Then she lay on the canvas with the heirlooms beside her. The knives rested near her ribs. The letter rested near her shoulder. The medal, returned to its felt, rested inside the tin beneath the bench's open shadow. Snow began again sometime after dark, light against the roof, patient against the windows, covering the lane back to town without erasing it. Quinn slept with one hand open. Not holding. Ready. The first snow that stayed came on December 3rd, 5 inches by noon and another 2 before dark. It did not fall with drama. It came in small, deliberate flakes that seemed to have decided long before morning where they meant to land. By breakfast, the lane had softened over. The walnut limbs carried white along their upper sides, and the den's failing roof showed its weakness more plainly than any photograph had. Snow gathered deep along the rear plane, slid a little, stopped, and pressed its cold weight down into the sagging cedar shakes. Quinn stood outside with the manual under her coat and watched the roofline. She had read the roof chapter 3 times by then, once beside the stove while oats thickened in the kettle, once at the bench, copying the drawings of rafters sheathing felt drip edge and shingle courses onto scrap paper, once aloud because spoken words entered her differently, and because certain instructions needed to be heard in the room where they would be tested. Do not begin a roof without weather, daylight, dry staging, and a second pair of eyes if height is involved. The manual had not been written for a young woman alone with a red plastic sled, a county deed, and a building that seemed to lean toward mercy but could not yet be trusted. Still, it gave enough to begin measuring. The den was 24 feet long and 16 feet wide, with a roof pitch shallow enough to worry Silas Mercer and steep enough to punish carelessness. Quinn used twine, a pencil stub, and the old folding rule she found in the workroom case to calculate the rear plane first. 12 feet from eave to ridge, 24 feet across, plus waist, plus overlap, plus the part where the sag had bowed the old line. She wrote numbers until they steadied into a list. 6 bundles of cedar shingles would not be enough. 8 might be safe, 30-pound roofing felt, 1 roll. Galvanized roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, at least 5 pounds. Drip edge, 12 10-foot lengths if she could afford them. Fewer if Silas had salvage. Tar paper caps, chalk line, sister stock for 2 rafters. Spruce 2x6 8-foot lengths. A small pry bar, roofing cement for the chimney flashing. Though the chimney work would come later, more than she could carry in one trip, more than the account deserved. When she brought the list to Rangeley Hardware, Silas read it without comment, then took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. You read the chapter. 3 times. Good. Read it again. I will. You know a roof kills faster than a draft. Yes, sir. He looked toward the back room of the store, where a narrow staircase rose to storage. Come here. He led her past boxes of lantern globes, snow shovel handles, rubber boots, and a shelf of paint cans marked down because the colours had been mixed wrong for people who changed their minds. From a peg near the back door, he took a roofing hatchet with a square face, a gauge notch, and a worn leather grip dark from hand oil. The head was spotted, but the edge had been kept. My brother's, Silas said. Quinn did not reach for it. He was the one who wrote in the book. Some of the useful parts. Silas held the hatchet out. You bring it back. Yes, sir. No swinging from your shoulder, wrist and elbow. Let the head do the work. Yes, sir. And you do not get on that roof alone. She had no answer that was not either false or proud. Silas looked past her to the front window. Amond Pike still owes me for stove bolts. The man he brought 2 days later was 74, narrow as a fence rail, with white hair under a knitted cap and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against sun on snow. Eamon Pike had roofed camps, barns, churches, and one schoolhouse gymnasium before his knees became unreliable, and his son began telling people he was retired. He carried no tool bag, only a thermos and a pencil behind one ear. I don't take pay, he said before Quinn could ask. I have to give something. You can listen. That was the whole bargain. They worked 11 days, not in a row because weather had authority, but in the rhythm December allowed. Eamon stood on the ground the first morning and made her remove every loose thing beneath the rear plane before they touched the roof. Antler racks shifted, tools covered, stove banked low, canvas pulled away from the danger line. Then he made her build, staging from planks. Silas had sent as salvage, testing each board and rejecting 2 because the grain had split near a knot. That one lies, he said. Quinn set it aside. The old shingles came off in brittle layers. Some lifted cleanly with the pry bar, others broke into cedar scales under her hand. Under them the felt had rotted into black lace, and beneath that the sheathing showed both grace and failure. Much of it remained sound, hand-cut boards laid with gaps that had once allowed the roof to breathe. But along the sag 2 rafters had bowed, one cracked at the birdsmith, the other softened where water had followed a nail for years. Eamon tapped the cracked rafter with the roofing hatchet. Sister it. Quinn held the new spruce board against the old member while he watched the fit. Tighter. She shifted it. Again. She shifted it another 1/8. There. He taught with few words and no comfort, which meant each sentence mattered. Pilot holes where old wood might split, carriage bolts staggered, not lined like a tear waiting to happen, washers against tired grain. Sister rafter snug to the old one but not forced past its shape, because the point was support, not punishment. When she drove the first nail proud by the thickness of a dime, Eamon said, "That nail's proud." She looked. "Pull it." She pulled it. The 3-stroke nail became its own lesson. Set the point, drive straight, finish flush, do not peck, do not pound as if anger improved steel. By the 3rd day her forearm ached from wrist to elbow, and her thumb had opened where the glove seam rubbed. By the 6th, the sound of her hammer changed. Even she could hear it, less scatter, more decision. They snapped chalk lines in blue across the new felt. Eamon showed her how the first course mattered more than it looked, how one careless beginning made every upper line lie. They laid shingles with proper exposure, leaving a small breathing gap between each, staggering joints, discarding pieces that curled or cupped too sharply. Where the roof met the chimney, he did not let her trust old flashing. They patched only enough to shed snow until the masonry could be rebuilt. Every afternoon when light began to leave the trees, Eamon climbed down first, then stood with both hands on the ladder until Quinn's boots touched the ground. On the last day, December 15th, the sky cleared in a pale sheet above the lake, and the new rear plane held a clean, dark pattern against the older front roof. It was not handsome in the way catalogue cabins were handsome. The front still needed work, the chimney still leaned, the siding remained weathered and rough, but the sag had been lifted, braced, covered, and given a chance to carry winter without surrendering. Eamon drank the last of his coffee and looked up. "It'll shed." Quinn waited, but he did not add anything. After he left, she stood beneath the repaired roof inside the workroom and listened to the absence of dripping. Snow slid once above her, then fell cleanly beyond the wall. For that evening enough had been done. January hardened everything. The snow that had fallen soft in December became layered, crusted and blue in the shadows. The lane took a shine in the mornings where her boots had packed it down. The outhouse door stuck, the well cover froze at the edges, and each time Quinn lifted the stones she had to break a little collar of ice first. Inside the den the stove became both comfort and warning, because every fire depended on a chimney whose age had not yet been answered fully. From below the draught had improved. From above Eamon had seen trouble. "Spalling," he said, standing in the snow with his head tipped back. Quinn followed his gaze to the chimney crown. The top bricks had begun to shed their faces. Freeze and thaw had entered them year after year, expanding water into powder, powder into gaps, gaps into weakness. The mortar near the upper courses had lost its bond and could be scraped out with a nail. Some joints near the stove thimble had turned sandy, falling away in pale crumbs when touched. Silas came out one afternoon with a mason's trowel, a bucket and a sack of old notes from his brother's shop. "Portland cement is too hard for that," he said. "You pack modern pride into old brick and the brick loses." He sold her hydraulic lime by the small bag, fireclay by weight and sand screened fine enough for pointing. The mixture for exterior joints he wrote on the back of a hardware receipt, 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, enough water for a stiff peanut butter set. For the stove thimble and inner fire-facing places, he had her mix 3 parts sand, 1 part fireclay, 1 part lime, dampened slowly and rested before use. "Do not drown it," he said. "Mortar isn't soup." "Yes, sir." The work lasted 3 weeks in temperatures that rarely rose above the 20s. She began by raking out failed joints with an old screwdriver, then a bent nail, then the proper joint rake. Silas loaned after seeing the condition of her fingers. Powdered mortar fell into her sleeves, hair, and boots. She brushed each joint clean with a stiff brush, misted the brick lightly when the air inside was too dry, and pressed new mortar into the gaps in narrow lifts rather than smearing over the surface like frosting. Outside work happened only in the kinder hours, between late morning and the first fall of shade. She set the ladder against the stone side where the ground held level, tied it at the top, and climbed with a bucket half full because a full bucket was a fool's argument with gravity. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes, even inside gloves. Because mortar demanded touch and gloves dulled judgment, she worked until her fingers lost their sense, climbed down, warmed them near the stove, waited through the bright pain of returning blood, then went back. The top bricks were the hardest. She removed only those that had failed, cleaned them if they could be saved, replaced 2 from Silas's salvage stack where they could not. He had old soft brick from a torn-down bake oven, close enough in age and porosity to live beside the originals without bullying them. She learned to butter the ends, tap gently, check level, and leave the face clean. She learned that wiping too much was worse than wiping too little. At night, her hands smelled of lime no matter how often she washed them. Fine cracks opened along her knuckles. She rubbed them with a little oil from the workroom bottle only after testing it and finding it still sweet enough to use on skin, but not yet trusted for tools. The oil darkened the cracks and stung faintly, which kept her awake while the stove settled. The final day came late in January, under a low sky that promised snow but withheld it. She had let the mortar cure as long as the cold allowed, keeping the stove low, then cold, though the room punished her for it. Silas told her not to test too soon. Amond, passing by with his thermos, told her the same thing with fewer words. Wait another day. She waited. On the test morning, she cleared the stove, checked the clean-out, set water nearby, and built the smallest fire she could make without insulting the work. Birch bark, 3 twigs, a ribbon of dry pine. The flame took and leaned toward the pipe. Smoke rose, entered, vanished upward. She stepped outside. The chimney breathed clean. No smoke leaked from the joints. No grey seam appeared near the thimble above the crown. A thin column lifted straight for several feet before the wind touched it and drew it east over the walnut trees. Quinn watched until the cold entered her sleeves. Then she went back in, sat on the floor in front of the stove, and held both hands near the iron. Not celebration. Relief with work still attached. The floors had waited under everything. Under soot, antler dust, mouse leavings, dried mud, old pine needles, spilled oil, plaster crumbs, and the grey powder that came from a house being cold too long. Wide white pine planks ran the length of the front room, joined by hand-cut rosehead nails that showed at irregular intervals, each nailhead dark and slightly proud, where the wood had shrunk back around it. In the workroom, the boards were harder worn near the bench, hollowed by decades of feet standing in the same patient places. Quinn did not want to sand them. That was the truth she admitted only after sweeping them for the 10th time and still seeing what time had hidden under dirt. Sanding felt severe. It removed, it corrected, it asked old boards to surrender the surface they had earned. But the manual had a chapter on flaws in camps and outbuildings, and Silas had a way of looking at damaged wood that made sentiment behave. You don't sand history away, he said. You take off what keeps it from breathing. He rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, adding the charge to the account with a pencil line so thin it seemed almost apologetic. He sent 80, 120, and 220 grit discs, a dust mask, and a warning written in his own block letters on the rental paper, keep moving. She began in the front room after removing every loose object she could move. The antler racks stayed, covered in canvas. The stove stayed. The bench stayed in the back because it could not be moved without a team, and because by then Quinn would not have allowed strangers to shift it carelessly. The first pass with 80 grit made the room sound like a hive trapped in a barrel. Dust rose despite the sander's bag, fine and pale, entering her hair, collar and lashes. She worked with the grain, slow but not lingering, letting the machine float rather than dig. Old stains lightened, grey lifted. Scratches blurred but did not vanish. Around the rose-head nails she changed to hand sanding, folding paper over a block, and working in small, careful strokes so the metal would not tear the disc or spark against hidden grit. The second pass with 120 grit changed the room. Not dramatically. Nothing in the den changed that way, but the boards began to take light differently. Under the dirt lay honey, darkened by age but still present. Near the door, where wet boots had crossed for generations, the wood remained marked. Near the stove, a black crescent had entered too deeply to erase. Quinn left it. A flaw without memory would have been a lie. The third pass with 220 grit took 2 days because her shoulders had become slow and the sander's weight seemed to increase after each hour. She hand-sanded the workroom around the bench legs and along the wall where the Antler racks stood. Every evening she vacuumed with Silas's old shop vacuum, then wiped the boards with barely damp cloths until the water came away less grey. For finish, Silas advised a blend he trusted more than shine, tongue oil cut with a little linseed oil for the first coat, thinner penetration, then straight oil for the next 2, each rubbed in and wiped clean before it could gum, 48 hours between coats if the room held warmth, longer if it stayed cold. Oil made the floor speak. The first coat sank in almost immediately, thirsty enough to frighten her. The pale honey deepened. The second coat brought amber. The third applied by hand in small sections with rags, she later spread flat outdoors so they would not heat and catch, turned the oldest boards toward mahogany where foot traffic and smoke had aged them most. Grain rose like water lines on a map, knots darkened, nail heads showed as small irregular stars. She walked barefoot across one finished strip after it cured, not because it was wise in January, but because she needed to know the floor through skin. It felt less cold than before, or perhaps she had changed. Then came the bad morning. It arrived without cause large enough to name. The roof had held, the chimney drew, the floor was nearly finished. The money remained sealed in the tin except for careful withdrawals recorded in the book. The account at Rangeley Hardware had begun to shrink after Quinn spent 3 afternoons stacking lumber, cleaning bins, and sharpening garden tools for early spring. By practical measures, the work was going forward. Still, on a late January morning, she could not lift the sander. She stood over it for several minutes with her hand on the handle, listening to the stove tick and the wind worry the walnut branches. Her body felt distant from instruction. The room seemed to tilt, not physically but in its demands. Every object needed, every repair led to 3 others. Every kindness created a debt of conduct, if not money. Even Miriam's letter, which had welcomed her, had also placed history gently but firmly into her hands. Quinn unplugged the sander. She put on her coat and walked to the marsh beyond the lane where the land opened toward a frozen crease of water. The snow had crusted enough to hold in some places and betray in others. Twice she sank to the knee. She kept going until she reached a stand of cattails bent under frost. There, beside a black ribbon of unfrozen water, stood a great blue heron. It should have been south or hidden or wiser, but it stood on one leg in the cold, its long neck folded, its grey body nearly the same colour as the morning. The bird did not move when she arrived. Quinn stopped far enough away not to trouble it and lowered herself onto a fallen log. For 1 hour she did nothing. Then another. The heron shifted once, placed its foot down with great deliberation, and took 3 slow steps along the water's edge. It struck at something Quinn could not see and missed. It resumed waiting without embarrassment. By noon, Quinn's hands had gone numb inside her mittens. She returned to the den, ate oats, fed the stove, and did no work for the rest of the day. Nothing collapsed because she had stopped. The next morning, she finished the floor near the door. By February, light had become a repair of its own. The den had 8 windows, 3 had no glass at all, only warped boards nailed across the openings from outside. 4 were cracked in 1 or more panes, their lines wandering through the glass like frozen lightning. 1 window in the workroom above the pattern shelf held its original wavy panes, each one slightly uneven, catching the world in a softened form. Silas believed it might date from the earliest structure that had stood there, moved and reset when the den was rebuilt. Doris, after looking through a county note, said it could be from 1788, though no one could prove whether the sash had belonged first to a trading shed, a camp, or a dwelling long gone. "Do not replace that one," Silas said. "I won't. Not even if it rattles. I won't." The other 7 demanded work before March winds arrived. She began by removing the boards from the empty frames. Behind them, dead flies lay along the sills in little black drifts. Old putty clung in hardened ridges. Glazing points had rusted nearly flat. She set each sash on the bench only after covering the surface with canvas, because the oak did not need glass cuts added to its own marks. Silas sold her salvaged panes from a storm window taken off a camp near the lake. Not perfect, not matched, but sound. He showed her how to bed glass in putty rather than forcing it against bare wood, how to press glazing points just enough to hold without cracking the pane, and how to tool the putty at a clean bevel so water would shed instead of linger. The putty came in a white can labelled DAP 33. "It skins before it cures," Silas said. "Remember that about people too." Quinn looked at him. He shrugged. "Old storekeepers get 1 sentence a week." The technique took patience of a different kind from carving. Putty had to be warmed in the hand until it yielded, rolled into a thin rope, pressed into the rabbet, then flattened beneath glass with even pressure from the heel of the palm. Too much and the pane shifted. Too little and air would enter. She set points with a putty knife, not a hammer, after cracking 1 practice pane and standing very still while the sound of it finished breaking. The cracked windows took longer because the sash cords had failed in 2 of them. The weights had dropped into their pockets with dull authority, leaving the windows either painted shut or loose enough to threaten fingers. Silas sent 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, and Amond, who had apparently roofed windows as well as roofs, came by long enough to show her the knot. "Figure 8, he said. He tied it once slowly. She tied the next. Again. She tied it again. The counterweight felt heavier than its size when she lifted it from the pocket, a cold iron shape coated with dust. She threaded the cord over the pulley, down into the hollow side channel, tied the knot through the weight's eye, then checked that it seated properly before closing the pocket. When the sash rose and held for the first time, she raised and lowered it 6 times just to feel the old mechanism remember its purpose. For the workroom's original window she did almost nothing. She cleaned it with warm water and a soft cloth, careful around the brittle putty that still held. She did not scrape away every stain. She did not polish the waviness out of sight, because no cloth could do that and no honest hand would try. When wind entered at the meeting rail, she made a temporary rope of cotton cloth and tucked it lightly, promising the window a better repair when warmer weather allowed. Day by day, the den changed under the return of glass. The front room brightened first. Morning came farther across the floor, reaching the stove legs, then the lower shelf, then the wall where the antler racks stood. The cracks that remained in 2 panes were stable, and Quinn sealed them until replacements could be cut properly. The empty openings stopped breathing snow. At night, candlelight reflected back from the glass instead of disappearing into black boards. The last window was the narrow one above the front counter. It had been boarded so long that removing the planks felt like opening an eye. The wood resisted, then gave. Cold light entered in a sudden rectangular spill. Quinn stood on the inside with the pry bar in her hand while dust moved through the beam. Outside, on a walnut branch no thicker than her thumb, a chickadee landed. The bird looked in. It carried the whole winter in its small body, black cap sharp, breast pale, feet closed around the branch with exact confidence. It turned its head once toward the den, then once toward the lane, as if comparing the repaired room with the weather it had endured. Quinn did not move. After a few seconds, the chickadee gave one small shake of its feathers and flew toward the trees. Quinn set the new pane into its bed of putty, pressed the points, and tooled the bevel smooth with the knife Silas had given her for windows, not the carving knives. Those she kept wrapped unless the work called their name. By late afternoon, the last sash was back in place. 8 windows held light again, though each held it differently, 3 new panes clear and plain, 4 cracked or mended but faithful, 1 old wavy glass keeping the world softened in its uneven memory. Quinn washed her hands, stood in the center of the front room, and watched February settle outside without entering. The den was not restored. Not yet. But it was no longer open to every harm that passed by. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, Quinn finished the first piece she was willing to call complete. Not finished because every line was perfect. Not finished because the Antler had obeyed her without argument. Finished because the work had reached the point where further cutting would no longer be repair, but vanity. Amos had warned her about that long ago, and Miriam had written it in another language of the same truth. A maker had to know when to put down the knife. The piece was no larger than her palm, cut from a narrow moose antler plate Silas Mercer had found in a trapper's estate box, and sold to her for 1 old silver dime from the tin, though he had tried to refuse the coin until she set it on the counter and stepped back. It showed a river opening through ice, the first mark of the reading chain, but it did not copy Miriam's hand. Quinn had studied the older piece for months by lamplight, traced its path in the air, read its silence, and then put it away before beginning her own. She had soaked the Antler 48 hours, changing the water morning and night, then wrapped it in wool by the stove until the surface gave slightly under her thumbnail. She sawed with the grain, slow enough that the thin blade did not chatter. She cut the first lines with Amos's straight knife and deepened the shadow with the bent knife from the cedar compartment. When the groove resisted, she stopped. When her wrist grew tired, she stopped. When memory tried to make her hurry, she stopped. The last polish took most of a day, pumice and oil, then chamois, then bare palm. By evening, snow had begun again beyond the windows, and the little river in the Antler gathered stovelight without glare. Quinn set it on the oak bench and left it there overnight, because some things needed to spend their first darkness in the room that had taught them. The den had changed by then, but not beyond recognition. It had not been made new. Quinn had learned to distrust newness where restoration was required. Newness often erased what patience might have saved. The cedar roof had settled into its second winter without sagging. The chimney drew clean and straight. The floors, dark honey where morning touched them and mahogany near the bench, held the marks she had refused to sand away. 8 windows kept out weather and let in the lake-coloured light, including the old wavy pane that softened every passing crow into something half-remembered. The front room had 2 chairs now, neither matching. One came from Doris Whitcomb's cousin after a kitchen remodel, the other from the church basement repaired with glue, clamps, and a strip of rawhide under the seat. The stove sat black and serviceable on a hearth. Quinn had reset stone by stone. Above it hung a narrow shelf for candles, matches, and a tin of stove polish. The Antler racks remained along the wall, cleaner now, each bundle tagged in pencil and cotton string. The back room belonged to work again. Not to production, not yet. To work in the older sense, the kind that arranged itself around weather, light, muscle, and conscience. The oak bench stood where it had always stood, its hidden compartment closed but no longer unknown. The heirloom tools rested in a wall case Quinn had lined with new cedar. Miriam's letter lay wrapped in chamois inside the narrow wooden box, taken out 4 times a year, read at the turn of each season, folded again along the same original creases. The 18 Antler pieces were kept together in a shallow drawer Quinn built beneath the patterned shelf. She had made dividers for them from basswood, each notch fitted to hold without pinching. The river piece sat first. The others followed in the order she had slowly learned, not only from the carvings, but from walking the land until certain shapes in bone answered, certain shapes in water, branch, moon, and track. The brass key had waited on the mantel for almost 2 years. She had found it in the small oak box under the 3rd cellar step in late winter of her first year there, beside a tintype photograph of a young woman with Quinn's face standing before the den in the summer of 1903. The woman's dress was dark, her sleeves rolled, one hand holding a carving knife with the calm familiarity of labour. On the back, in brown ink, someone had written, "Eliza Tallpine, daughter of Joseph, age 25, summer of 1903. The key's bow was shaped like the river mark. Quinn had tried it nowhere at first, not the locked drawer, not the old tool case. Not the front door or the tin box or the cedar chest she built later. Something about the key asked for a patient ignorance, so it sat on the mantel through spring thaw, through mosquito season, through the first full autumn when she stacked 5 cords of wood under tin, through the next winter when the snow reached the lower window sashes and made the den feel buried but not lost. The answer came from the walnut tree. Not by revelation, by rot. In November of 2024, after 3 days of wet wind, a limb fell from the oldest walnut north of the well and split open along a dark seam. Quinn cut the broken branch into stove lengths and found, in the torn place where the limb had joined the trunk, a green stain on the wood, not natural, copper or brass. She cleared loose bark with her knife and saw a narrow plate set into the tree, almost swallowed by growth. She did not pry it. For 2 days she only studied it. The plate sat chest high on the south side of the trunk, hidden from the lane and invisible unless the branch had come down. It had a keyhole shaped not like a modern lock, but like a long throat with a round eye at top. Around it, the tree had grown in a slow lip, trying to close over metal and memory alike. On the 3rd morning she took the brass key from the mantel. It entered reluctantly, then fully. When she turned it, something inside the trunk gave a dry click, and a small door, no wider than her handspan, loosened from the bark. Quinn opened it with 2 fingers. Inside was a hollow lined with tin, dry as a cupboard. A folded flag lay within, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with black ribbon. When Quinn carried it inside and opened it on the bench, she counted the stars before she allowed herself to believe them, 48. The cloth was faded but intact, its white stripes browned at the creases, its blue field dark as winter evening. Beneath the flag was a note. The paper was smaller than Miriam's letter, the handwriting less formal, written by someone whose hand had laboured hard before taking up the pen. To the child who keeps the house. This flag covered Samuel Tallpine's coffin for 1 hour on May 30th, 1919, before the town took it back because the paper did not name him correctly, and because some men believed our dead should be grateful for any cloth at all. Daniel brought it home folded under his coat. I have kept it where no official hand will inventory it. Samuel was not buried with full honour, but he is not without witness when the time comes. Place this with Joseph's medal or keep both until someone after you understands the cost of being renamed by others. Do not let them tell you a family begins where records begin. Eliza Tallpine. November 11th, 1919. Quinn read the date twice. Armistice Day, 1 year after the guns had stopped in Europe, and 6 months after a coffin had been given a flag only briefly, as if honour could be lent and withdrawn by office hours. She folded the note back exactly as she had found it. Then she sat at the bench with the 48-star flag before her, Joseph's medal from 1944 beside it, Miriam's letter to the left, and the first river carving above them all. The room held them without surprise. Perhaps it had known all along that one hidden thing would lead to another, not quickly, not in spectacle, but by the slow courtesy of being ready. The medal was taken to the cemetery the following Memorial Day, May 26, 2025. Quinn chose that date because it belonged to public remembrance, and because Miriam had asked that the dead be named properly. Doris helped her find the record. Silas drove her to the Maine Veterans Memorial Cemetery in Augusta, though he claimed he had errands in the city and did not want to waste gasoline by making 2 trips. Reverend Boyd from the white church near the lake met them there in his dark coat, hat in hand. There was no large ceremony. Quinn preferred it that way. She stood near a stone marked for men of the Second World War and held Joseph's medal in both hands. Reverend Boyd spoke 4 words before lowering his head. Lord, remember him rightly. The medal was not buried. Quinn had learned enough to know that some objects should remain with their story unless a family, a tribe, or a rightful keeper chose otherwise. She brought it home afterward and placed it in a small glass-fronted case beside the folded flag, with a handwritten card naming Joseph Tallpine Waban, killed near Anzio in 1944, and Samuel Tallpine, misnamed in records but not forgotten in the house. The money had lasted because Quinn made it last. She did not buy a car, she did not buy new furniture, she did not replace her coat until the lining had given way beyond repair, and even then bought one from the church rummage room for $4, paying with ordinary wages earned from work at the hardware store. From the hidden tin, she spent only what the den itself required, and only after writing the amount in a ledger kept under the front counter. 3 coins left the cash in those first 2 years. 1 mercury dime went to Silas for the Antler plate. 1 silver quarter purchased a box of old photographs from an estate sale after Doris saw the Tallpine name on the back of one and set it aside. 1 wheat penny, too worn to read, Quinn carried to the lake and placed under the 3rd stone by the well on the morning she reopened the shop, not as payment but as acknowledgement. A 4th coin nearly went to Caleb, the boy who had once split kindling for her after school and refused every bill she offered because his mother had known her grandfather. He would not take it. He had grown taller by then, his voice not yet settled into itself, his old Schwinn replaced by a rusted pickup that complained when it turned in the lane. When she tried to hand him a $50 for helping reset the front step, he closed her fingers around it and shook his head. Not for that, so the coin went back into the tin. The rest of the money remained sealed in the oak bench, wrapped again in oilcloth inside the cedar compartment. Quinn added a note of her own to the tin, not a full letter yet, only a record, what had been found, what had been spent, what remained and why. At the bottom she wrote, for the next one, if one comes cold. The shop reopened without announcement. No ribbon, no newspaper, no sign in the road larger than the weathered one above the door, recut only enough to make the words legible again. The first notice was an index card pinned to the corkboard at Doris's cafe, below the menu for fish chowder and beside a flyer for piano lessons. Tallpine carving. Antler repair. Small work by hand. N.O. Rush orders. Leave name with Doris. The card brought 3 people the first week. A man with a broken antler button from his father's hunting coat, a woman whose grandmother's hair comb had lost 1 tooth, a retired schoolteacher who brought nothing to repair but stayed an hour looking at the small river carving in the display case, then wrote her name on the mailing list Quinn had placed beside the door. By the end of the 2nd winter, the list held 43 names. Most were local, some were not. One came from Vermont, written in blue ink by a woman who said her aunt remembered Amos. One from New Hampshire, left by a man who had guided with Silas's brother in the 70s. One from a daughter in Arizona ordering a replacement handle for her mother's old sewing awl, because her mother's hands could no longer grip the smooth one. Quinn wrote each name by hand into a ledger, instead of keeping them only on a phone she did not yet trust with things that mattered. She worked slowly, and people learned to wait. Or they did not. Those who did not wait were not her customers. Near Christmas of 2025, Caleb came up the lane with a long shape wrapped in a moving blanket in the back of his pickup. Snow had fallen the night before, and lay in the tire ruts like flour pressed into grooves. Quinn heard the truck before she saw it, then opened the front door as he climbed out, red-faced from cold, wearing gloves too thin for the weather. "I made something," he said. He had said it almost defensively, as if making could still be mistaken for foolishness. Together, they carried the wrapped piece inside and laid it on the front counter. Caleb pulled back the blanket. It was a sign. Not polished, not professionally lettered, not straight in the way machine work was straight, but it had strength. The board was pine, broad and thick, its edges shaped by drawknife. The letters had been carved deep and darkened with lamp-blackened wax, the way Quinn had shown him on scrap after he had asked casually, then returned 3 times to ask less casually. Tallpine daughters. Carving, repair, work by hand. Quinn read it once, then again. The plural entered the room and stayed. Caleb shifted his weight. "I know it's not right exactly." "It is right. There weren't daughters on the old sign." "No, but there should have been." Quinn placed her palm flat on the board, feeling the cuts, the hesitation in one curve, the steadiness in another. He had worked hard not to hurry, that showed more clearly than any flaw. "What do I owe you?" Caleb's ears reddened. My mother said not to make a bill. Your mother says that often. She said you could pay in candles when winter gets mean. Quinn looked toward the stove where 3 beeswax candles waited on the shelf, poured in old tins after Doris traded a sack of wax from a beekeeper cousin for repaired draw pulls. The economy of the town had become less visible but more exact around the den. Paper had its uses, so did barter. So did a kindness carried long enough to arrive as lumber with words cut into it. They hung the sign 2 days later when the weather cleared. Silas came with the ladder. Eamon came to tell them the ladder was poorly set, then set it properly himself. Doris stood in the lane with her coat buttoned wrong and pretended she had come only for a walk. Caleb held the sign while Quinn marked the holes. The old sign remained beneath, not removed, only lowered to the inside wall above the bench where its worn lettering could rest without weather. When the new sign was fastened over the door, nobody clapped. They stood back and looked. That was better. In the weeks after the sign went up, Quinn began writing her own letter. She did not begin because she felt old. She began because Miriam had not waited until certainty. Illness had pressed time around her, but the act itself belonged not to dying, only to responsibility. Quinn understood now that inheritance did not become safe when one person received it. It became safe when that person prepared to release it without greed. She used heavy paper from the bookshop, cream-coloured, not too smooth. She sharpened a pencil first and drafted by the stove. The first pages were poor. Too much explanation, too much fear of being misunderstood. She burned them in the stove and began again. The second attempt tried to sound wise and failed. She saved 1 sentence from it and burned the rest. The third began plainly enough to keep, "My dear one, whoever you are." She stopped after that line and let the words sit overnight. The next day she wrote about the roof, because a future inheritor would need to know where sister rafters had been placed and which shingles came from salvage. She wrote about the chimney and the mortar mixture, about the original window not to be replaced, about the oak bench and the hidden tray, though not the opening mechanism in full. Some knowledge had to be earned by careful looking. She wrote about Miriam, Amos, Eliza, Joseph, Samuel, and the names still missing. She wrote about Doris, Silas, Eamon, Caleb, Reverend Boyd, the bakery woman whose name she never learned, and the security guard who had given her 5 extra minutes of heat. She wrote that money could save a life and still ruin judgment if treated like permission. She wrote that repair should begin with what keeps weather out and fire safe. She wrote that no one should sell the reading chain unless hunger stood at the door with no other face. She wrote that the house was not a prize. Outside, the walnut trees stood bare against January light. Inside, the stove ticked, the tools waited, and the little river carving rested beneath glass near the front counter. Quinn wrote until her hand cramped, then laid the pencil down. She had not finished the letter. She did not need to finish it that day. The house had been waiting, and so had she. Spring came slowly that year, as it always did in Rangeley, not by calendar, by sound. First the drip from the eaves at noon, then the loosened rush of water under the culvert, then the smell of thawed earth near the well, dark and mineral. Chickadees came and went in the walnuts. The hound down the lane had grown older and barked with less conviction. Smoke rose from the colder chimney in the mornings, then not at midday, then not at all except when rain threatened. Quinn opened the front window on the first day warm enough to trust the air. The sash lifted smoothly, held by its cotton cord and counterweight. She stood there with both hands on the sill and listened to the lane becoming mud. The moose antler carving den waits. It has always waited. It waited under failed shingles and county stamps. It waited under cedar dust, antler racks, soot and snow. It waited through names miswritten, trades closed by paper, tools hidden from careless hands, and stories kept in material because no book had been offered room enough to hold them. It waited through a young woman sleeping cold on its floor with her last belongings against her ribs. It waited through repair, through hunger measured carefully, through kindnesses too small for monuments and too large to disappear. And in the clerk's office in town, beneath a glass paperweight on Doris Whitcomb's desk, the $5 bill remained. It had never gone into the drawer. Doris had written a note under it in her square, careful hand. First money paid for the Tallpine release. Do not spend. Some afternoons when the office was slow and snow or rain crossed the windows, a person waiting for a license renewal or tax form would notice the worn bill under the glass and ask about it. Doris would look at it for a moment before answering. She never told the whole story. That was not her way, and not every story should be made small enough for a counter. She would only say, "that bought a house nobody else could see." Then she would return to her paperwork, exact and quiet, while out beyond the lake road, past the church, the bait shed, the culvert and the walnut trees, Quinn Tallpine worked with a blade in her hand, not hurrying the cut.